May 25, 1942, 04:17 hours. Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. 14 feet below sea level, sealed inside a windowless bunker, a woman stared at numbers that could end the war or lose it in a single heartbeat. The air was thick, burnt dust, stale cigarette smoke, and something far heavier: fear. Rows of sleepless men in khaki uniforms hunched over typewriters, their faces washed pale under fluorescent lights that never switched off. Morse code crackled like distant lightning. Calculating machines hammered. Fingers tapped non-stop, trying to turn raw chaos into meaning before the Pacific collapsed. And in that basement, buried under noise, pressure, and classified desperation, one unnoticed woman was about to spot the mistake that would change everything. This was Station Hypo, the U.S. Navy's most secret code-breaking unit, and the last line of defense between America and total annihilation in the Pacific. On the far wall, a massive blackboard displayed thousands of 5-digit groups: 33487, 62901, 18554, row after row, column after column, a mathematical labyrinth that held every secret of the Imperial Japanese Navy. For 6 months they had tried to crack it. For 6 months, Japan had moved across the Pacific like a ghost fleet, striking without warning, vanishing without trace. The code was called JN25B. It was not a cipher. It was a fortress built from mathematics. And Admiral Chester Nimitz knew that unless they broke it within days, the next Japanese attack would shatter what remained of the American fleet. The Philippines had fallen. Singapore was gone. Wake Island, Guam, the Solomons, all consumed by the rising sun. And Washington had no idea where the enemy would strike next. Somewhere in those endless strings of numbers lay a target designated only by 2 letters: AF. But what those letters meant, what fleet was converging on that target, remained locked behind 33,000 possible code groups, each one encrypted with random additive keys that changed every single day. Margaret Howard sat at her desk in the corner, retyping intercepted messages for the 20th hour straight. Her fingers ached, her eyes burned, but she kept typing because somewhere in those numbers, buried beneath layers of encryption no machine could penetrate, lay the difference between survival and surrender. What none of them knew, not the commanders, not the mathematicians, not even the brilliant cryptanalyst Joseph Rochefort, pacing the room in his smoking jacket and slippers, was that the answer would come not from genius, but from a mistake. A single human error made by a tired Japanese radio operator 4,000 miles away. And it would be a woman, forbidden from reading the secret she transcribed, who would notice it first. By spring 1942, Japan wasn't winning through superior firepower. It was winning through invisible precision. Every American defeat, the sinking of the Houston, the fall of Corregidor, the ambush at Java Sea, had been orchestrated through an intricate web of radio signals pulsing across 64 million square miles of ocean. Japan's naval code, JN25, was more than encryption. It was a weapon of surgical planning, a mathematical shield that made their entire fleet untouchable. The system was diabolical in its elegance. First, every word or phrase, aircraft carrier, attack, commence operation, refuel, was converted into a 5-digit number selected from a codebook containing 33,000 entries. That alone made decryption nearly impossible. But the Japanese didn't stop there. Each 5-digit code group was then encrypted a second time using an additive cipher, a series of random numbers from a 300-page book, added to each group using non-carrying addition. Even if the Americans somehow captured the code book without the additive key, every message remained pure gibberish, and the keys changed constantly. The men and women of Station Hypo had been staring at that gibberish since December 7, 1941, the day Pearl Harbor burned. Every day, radio operators at listening posts in Dutch Harbor, Guam, and Australia intercepted Japanese transmissions and funneled them to Honolulu, where they piled up like snowdrifts of defeat. They logged over 1,000 intercepted messages per week, most of them thousands of digits long. Each time an analyst found a pattern, the additive key shifted, shattering every clue. The work was excruciating, cross-eyed, soul-crushing labor that drove men to collapse at their desks. They compared columns of digits for microscopic repetitions, built frequency distribution tables, tracked the occurrence of every 5-digit group across thousands of messages. Nothing stayed stable long enough to prove anything. Commander Joseph Rochefort, the eccentric genius leading Station Hypo, had stopped leaving the building entirely. He slept on a cot in his office, wore a smoking jacket and carpet slippers instead of his uniform, and spoke in cryptic quotes that nobody understood. But even he could not conjure progress from chaos. "We are fighting an army of ghosts," he told his deputy one night, eyes red-rimmed from sleeplessness. Washington sent more mathematicians. They built punch card sorting machines, statistical formulas, cross-reference charts. None of it worked. The British had cracked Germany's Enigma with machines, but JN-25 defied machines. It was too vast, too fluid, built on a logic of beautiful, unbreakable chaos. By May, intercepted traffic surged sharply. Entire squadrons of Japanese warships were mobilizing, converging on a location identified only by those two letters, AF. Send supplies to AF. Air reconnaissance over AF scheduled 3rd June. Carrier Division 1 to rendezvous near AF. The analysts believed AF referred to Midway Atoll, a tiny spit of coral 1,200 miles northwest of Hawaii, America's last line of defense before the West Coast. But the intelligence officers could not act on belief. Admiral Nimitz demanded proof. Without it, the Pacific Fleet would have to guess where to fight, and one wrong guess would hand Japan the war. In Washington, senior cryptologists debated whether JN-25 could even be broken before the war ended. Agnes Meyer Driscoll, the legendary First Lady of Naval Cryptology, who had first attacked JN-25 in 1939, had made critical progress on the cipher structure, but she'd been transferred off the project in 1940. Her pioneering work had laid the foundation, but the code had changed since then.
The analysts at Station Hypo had almost given up. Then, a small error changed everything. If you're still watching, you're clearly into deep World War II intelligence stories. Hit like so this reaches more history fans. Margaret Howard was not supposed to be here. She was 24 years old, a former bookkeeper from Chicago who had enlisted in the Navy after Pearl Harbor with dreams of serving her country. Instead, they handed her a typewriter and told her to transcribe numbers. Her official title, Clerical Assistant, Station Hypo. Her actual role? Invisible. She lived in a converted dormitory near Makiki Heights, rose before dawn, and walked the last mile to the base while Honolulu slept beneath blackout curtains. The guards at the gate barely glanced at her ID. Women came and went by the hundreds, yeomen, typists, file clerks, pushing paper through the machinery of war while men made the decisions. Inside Station Hypo, the noise never stopped. Teletype machines hammered out intercepted transmissions 24 hours a day. IBM punch card sorters whirred and clicked, processing frequency counts. The air vibrated with the mechanical drone of ventilation fans, keeping the equipment from overheating in the Hawaiian humidity. Margaret's job was brutally simple. Take the raw intercept sheets, covered in handwritten 5-digit groups copied by radio operators, and retype them cleanly so the cryptanalysts could read them without mistakes. Accuracy, not intelligence, was the rule. She wasn't supposed to interpret. She wasn't supposed to question. She wasn't supposed to think. But even rules erode under endless repetition. After her second week, she began noticing something strange. Certain groups of numbers returned again and again, not in the same order, but with uncanny regularity. Sometimes they differed by only a single digit, as if someone had copied the same phrase but mistyped one key. 33487, 33477, 33487, 62901, 62911, 62901. To most of the analysts, these anomalies meant nothing. The Japanese traffic was enormous. Coincidences were expected. Random noise. But Margaret had spent 3 years as a bookkeeper balancing ledgers for a Chicago meatpacking firm. She knew the texture of numbers, the way repetition carried weight. When she saw a pattern, she felt it like music buried beneath static. The more she typed, the more she noticed the rhythm. Her typewriter was an Underwood Standard, military issue, black metal frame, worn ribbon that had been reused too many times. After hours of continuous typing, faint ghost letters bled through from previous pages, leaving a palimpsest of digits barely visible beneath fresh ink. One afternoon, while replacing the ribbon, she held it up to the fluorescent light and saw something that made her breath catch. The same 5-digit group, printed twice, separated by only a few keystrokes. And where the sequences repeated, the incompression was darker, as if the typewriter itself was trying to show her the pattern. To her, it looked like music notes repeating in a hidden melody. The men in the room saw none of it. They moved through their tasks with military precision, chain-smoking, muttering frequency counts, filling blackboards with statistical distributions. Margaret, the only woman in her section, knew better not to interrupt. She kept her discovery to herself. But she began quietly marking the pages with a pencil. Tiny dots beside recurring sequences, a private map of something she didn't yet understand. If you're still watching, you're clearly someone who loves deep military history told the way it actually happened, not the sanitized version, but the truth buried in basement rooms and typewriter ribbons. Do me a favor, hit like, write a comment with your thoughts on whether the unsung workers of history deserve recognition, and subscribe so these forgotten stories don't disappear into the dark. Her daily life followed the relentless rhythm of the code room. 12-hour shifts, lunch from a tin tray eaten over her typewriter. Letters from home, censored and delayed. On Sundays, she washed her uniform in the communal sink and wrote in a notebook she never showed anyone. In those private pages, she described her growing fascination with the numbers. It feels alive, like the ocean tides. They change, but they repeat. There's an intelligence behind it, not ours, but theirs. And I think they made a mistake. One afternoon in late May, Lieutenant Joseph Finnegan, one of Rochford's hand-picked cryptanalysts, stopped by her desk to drop another stack of intercepts. He glanced at the pile she'd already finished and frowned. "Why are some of these marked?" he asked, pointing to the tiny pencil dots. Margaret hesitated. "They repeat, sir. I thought it might help." Finnegan was exhausted, running on coffee and duty. He shrugged. "Don't waste time on patterns, Miss Howard. They don't mean anything unless the frequency analysis confirms them." He walked away before she could reply. The dismissal stung, but it didn't stop her. That night, when her shift ended and the others shuffled out to catch a few hours of sleep, Margaret stayed behind under the pretense of cleaning her machine. With the lights dimmed and the building silent except for the hum of distant fans, she unspooled the typewriter ribbon and stretched it between her fingers. The alternating impressions shimmered under the fluorescent glow. Numbers layered on numbers, echoes within echoes.
It struck her that the patterns weren't random. They formed cycles. Every 12 lines, the same clusters returned. It was as if the Japanese operators were using some hidden rhythm to their transmissions, a mathematical heartbeat. She didn't yet know that what she was seeing was additive key repetition, the flaw Agnes Meyer Driscoll had first identified in JN25's cipher structure back in 1939. The vulnerability that Station Hypo was desperately trying to exploit. All she knew was that the repetition was real, and that no one else had noticed. The next morning, she made a decision that would alter the course of the Pacific War. She brought her marked pages and the damaged ribbon to Lieutenant Finnegan. "Sir," she said quietly, laying them on his desk, "I think the Japanese are reusing their keys." Finnegan looked at her, then at the papers, then back at her.
"Show me," he said. It happened on May 26, 1942. Margaret's typewriter jammed mid-line with a sharp metallic snap while she was transcribing a fresh intercept marked Tokyo to Carrier Division 1, Priority Alpha. The ribbon had torn straight through its center, the inked fabric dangling like a severed nerve. She reached for a replacement, but something about the tear made her stop. Along the frayed edge, faint mirror images of numbers glimmered where the ink had struck twice. Two sequences, almost identical, lay side by side, different by only a single digit in the middle. She held the ribbon closer to the light, and for the first time she saw the full shape of the flaw. At first she thought it was coincidence, another smudge from overuse, but when she cross-referenced the original intercept sheets she had typed before the ribbon broke, the same pattern appeared again. Pairs of 5-digit groups repeating with surgical precision, offset by the same 1-digit variation. She pulled older transcripts from the filing cabinet, pages she had typed 3 days earlier, and found the same rhythm echoing there. The repetition wasn't random. It was mechanical, consistent, measured, almost musical. Margaret brought the torn ribbon directly to Lieutenant Finnegan. He was hunched over a frequency distribution table, his desk buried under stacks of partially decoded messages. He studied the ribbon under his magnifying glass, muttering numbers to himself. 12-line interval, always 12 lines apart. He compared it to the transmission log timestamps. Japanese radio stations rotated their broadcast frequencies every 12 hours. The math matched perfectly. "This can't be chance," Finnegan said, his voice tight with controlled excitement. "They're reusing the same additive sequence." He turned to Margaret, eyes wide. "Do you realize what this means?" She didn't, not yet. To her, it was still just a pattern, a rhythm she could not ignore. But Finnegan knew that repetition was death to any cipher. The Japanese code depended on absolute randomness, each message encrypted with a unique additive key. If operators accidentally reused the same key even once, the two messages could be subtracted from each other using differential cryptanalysis, canceling out the encryption layer and revealing the underlying code structure. And the proof of that repetition, the fatal echo that would crack JN25 wide open, was now stretched across the fabric of a secretary's broken typewriter ribbon. Finnegan grabbed the ribbon and sprinted down the corridor to Commander Rochfort's office. Rochfort had been awake for 36 hours straight, surviving on black coffee and sheer stubborn will. His desk was buried under stacks of partially decoded messages. When Finnegan burst through the door and laid the torn ribbon on his desk, Rochfort leaned forward and stared at it in silence for a long, suffocating moment. Then he laughed. A dry, exhausted laugh that startled everyone within earshot. "Gentlemen," he said,
his voice cracking with fatigue and something close to wonder. "We've been looking for a door into this code for 6 months. This may be the keyhole." He immediately ordered a full forensic comparison of the affected intercepts. His team prepared differential subtraction tables, a cryptanalysis technique where repeated cipher groups are canceled against each other to expose the plain text beneath. For the first time in months, Station Hypo stirred with real energy. Margaret watched from her desk as mathematicians, linguists, and cryptanalysts swarmed around the evidence she had stumbled upon. They cut strips of the ribbon and mounted them under glass, comparing the ghost imprints to newly intercepted transmissions. When they subtracted one repeated sequence from another using non-carrying subtraction, patterns emerged, numerical residues that corresponded to known Japanese military terms: aircraft, attack, division, carrier. It wasn't full translation, but it was proof that JN-25 could bleed. The discovery traveled fast, whispered across the encrypted teletype network from Honolulu to OP-20G in Washington. Skeptics in the capital dismissed it as luck, insufficient evidence for operational planning. But Rochford knew that luck in war was currency, and he was ready to spend every penny. He ordered his team to build a master reconstruction table of repeated additive groups using Margaret's markings as the foundation. They cataloged thousands of partial keys, slowly reverse engineering the Japanese codebook, one word at a time. Every night, Margaret typed their findings, aligning decoded fragments with the precision of someone who understood that a single misplaced digit could cost thousands of lives. She no longer felt like a clerk. She felt like part of something vast, dangerous, and unstoppable. Days blurred into sleepless nights. The sound of typewriters and teleprinters merged into one continuous mechanical hum. Each breakthrough brought a rush of adrenaline. Each dead end brought another collapse into despair. Margaret rarely left the building. She slept on a cot in a side office, her dreams filled with cascading numbers swimming like fish through dark water. When she woke, she reached instinctively for the torn ribbon, still folded carefully in her pocket, proof that mistakes could matter. But not everyone welcomed her involvement. A senior cryptanalyst confronted Rochford one afternoon outside the cipher room. "You're basing operational intelligence on observations made by a clerk," he said, voice tight with frustration. "That's reckless." Rochford stopped walking and turned to face him, his exhaustion momentarily replaced by cold fury. "Reckless is ignoring the truth because it came from the wrong person," he said quietly. "We don't have the luxury of pride. We're fighting a war." He walked away before the argument could escalate. From that moment, Margaret's ribbon became an object of quiet defiance within Station Hypo, a reminder that war didn't care about rank, gender, or protocol. It only cared about results. By the first week of June, their reconstructed additive tables began producing coherent message fragments. One partially decrypted dispatch contained a phrase that changed everything. "AF will run short of water." Rochford suspected that AF was Midway Atoll, but Admiral Nimitz demanded absolute confirmation before committing America's last 3 carriers to battle. To prove it, Rochford devised a brilliant counterintelligence operation.
He instructed the U.S. garrison at Midway to transmit an uncoded message, deliberately sent in the clear so the Japanese would intercept it, reporting that their water distillation plant had suffered a mechanical breakdown. 2 days later, Tokyo sent an encrypted high-priority dispatch to its fleet units. AF reports water shortage, planned accordingly. The confirmation was absolute. AF was Midway, and Japan was walking straight into an ambush. Margaret read the summary bulletin posted on the operations board the next morning. The room erupted in applause. Some of the men wept openly, overcome by exhaustion and relief. She felt dizzy, overwhelmed by the realization that her accidental discovery, a torn typewriter ribbon and a pattern she couldn't ignore, had helped reveal the enemy's next move. The ribbon itself, now sealed in an envelope marked Evidence, Operational Cryptanalysis, rested in Commander Rochford's personal safe. When he passed Margaret in the hallway that afternoon, he stopped, gave her a rare, tired smile, and said, "Good work, Miss Howard. The Pacific Fleet owes you more than you'll ever know." Outside, the Hawaiian sun blazed over Pearl Harbor. Aircraft carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown were already preparing to sail northwest toward a tiny atoll most Americans had never heard of. The war that had once felt impossibly distant was now turning on the strength of mathematical precision, human intuition, and one woman who had refused to throw away a broken ribbon. The race began in silence. By June 1st, 1942, Station Hypo had transformed into a sealed world of paper, smoke, and frantic calculation. Daylight vanished behind blackout curtains. Clocks lost all meaning. The room smelled of ink, burnt coffee, and the metallic tang of exhaustion. Every desk overflowed with intercepted signals, thousands of them stacked in brittle towers that trembled when someone walked past. Each page represented a fragment of Japanese intent, and somewhere among those fragments lay the precise timing and direction of the next blow. Rochford's team divided into overlapping 12-hour shifts, so the work never stopped. At the center of the operation sat the master additive table, the partial cipher key that Margaret's discovery had made possible. Analysts pinned translucent acetate sheets over frequency grids, aligning repetitions and canceling out encryption layers like surgeons dissecting a tumor. The room buzzed with the scratch of pencils and the relentless clatter of typewriter keys. Whenever a message resolved into even a few intelligible words, someone would shout, "Hold that pattern," and a small crowd would gather to verify the math. Margaret worked beside Lieutenant Finnegan, retyping decoded fragments into coherent intelligence summaries. Her torn ribbon had been replaced, but she kept the original locked in her desk drawer, its edges still stained with ink and the fingerprints of history. Around her, the tempo intensified. New intercepts arrived every hour, carried in from the radio intercept station still warm from the teletype machine. Some were routine logistics, fuel requisitions, weather reports, but others came directly from Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, marked with priority codes reserved for major fleet operations. The pieces began to fit together like a nightmare taking shape. AF, the mysterious target, now appeared in context with unit designators for Carrier Division 1, Akagi, Kaga, and Carrier Division 2, Hiryu, Suryu. Phrases such as Operation MI and Main Body Rendezvous east of AF emerged from the static, confirming that Japan's largest carrier strike force was already underway. When analysts cross-referenced the decrypts with weather data, tide tables, and previous operational patterns, everything pointed to an attack within the first week of June. The strain was visible on every face: red eyes, trembling hands, voices gone hoarse from whispering 5-digit groups into the small hours of the morning. Rochford's uniform hung loose on his frame. He had stopped shaving, stopped eating regular meals. Yet beneath the exhaustion burned an almost religious certainty. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, they were ahead of the enemy. When one of the translators identified a cipher sequence corresponding to Akagi, Admiral Nagumo's flagship, the carrier that had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, the room erupted in muted cheers. For 6 months, those carriers had haunted Allied nightmares like avenging spirits. Now Station Hypo had their coordinates. Meanwhile, 4,000 miles to the west, the Imperial Japanese Navy was already in motion. 4 fleet carriers, 2 battleships, 11 destroyers, more than 250 aircraft. The largest naval strike force assembled since Pearl Harbor steamed eastward toward Midway, confident and unstoppable. Their code was unbreakable, their plans invisible, their victory inevitable. In the wardroom of the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo's officers toasted Operation MI each night with sake and supreme confidence. None of them imagined that a group of sleep-deprived codebreakers in a humid basement 1,200 miles away already knew their attack schedule almost to the hour. On June 3rd, Commander Rochford compiled his findings into a single classified intelligence summary. Enemy striking force, consisting of approximately 4 fleet carriers, will approach Midway from the northwest. Attack estimated dawn, 4 June 1942. The message went directly to Admiral Chester Nimitz at Pacific Fleet Headquarters. Nimitz read it twice in silence. Then he looked at his operations officer and said quietly, "We'll be waiting for them." Orders flashed across the Pacific. Carriers Enterprise, Hornet, and the battle-damaged Yorktown, hastily patched together in a 72-hour miracle of repair work, turned northwest toward Midway.
For the first time since the war began, the United States Navy would fight with the most powerful weapon in existence: perfect intelligence. Margaret watched the staff officers carry Rochefort's summary out of the cipher room. She realized with a shock that she had not stepped outside in 4 days. For a moment, she felt weightless, detached from everything except the mechanical pulse of the machines and the weight of what they had done. She thought about the ribbon, about how fragile the entire chain of discovery had been. A single human error by a tired Japanese radio operator, a torn strip of cloth on her typewriter, and now fleets of steel moving across the Pacific because of it. That night, the exhausted team gathered for coffee in the narrow hallway outside the cipher room. No one spoke of victory. They knew too well how easily intelligence could be wrong. A single misread digit could send an entire armada steaming into empty ocean. Still, they had done everything humanly possible. Margaret sat with her cup, staring at the floor. Lieutenant Finnegan broke the silence. "You realize," he said quietly, "if this works, we'll never be allowed to talk about it." Margaret nodded. "That's all right, as long as it works." Before the battle begins, if you're enjoying this deep storytelling, hit subscribe for more Untold World War II stories. June 4th, 1942. 0600 hours, Midway Atoll. The first message crackled through Station Hypo's receivers at dawn. Many planes heading Midway, bearing 320 degrees, distance 150 miles. The Japanese had arrived exactly as Rochefort predicted, and the American carriers were already in position, hidden northeast of Midway, waiting in ambush. While the radio room erupted in controlled chaos, Margaret kept typing intelligence updates, her fingers steady despite the tremor in her chest. She wasn't on the bridge of a warship, but she could feel the battle unfolding across 1,000 miles of ocean. Throughout that endless day, reports flooded in, first from Midway's battered airfields, then from carrier reconnaissance scouts. Enemy sighted, attack launched, hit on Akagi. Each transmission felt like an echo of the numbers she had once typed blindly, not understanding their meaning. Now they carried the weight of fire and steel, life and death. When the message finally arrived that all 4 Japanese carriers were burning, the cipher room fell into stunned silence. No one shouted. No one moved.
The enormity of it hung in the air like smoke. Commander Rochefort removed his glasses and rubbed his bloodshot eyes. "It's over," he whispered. "They walked right into it." Lieutenant Finnegan turned to Margaret, his voice barely audible. "Your ribbon did this," he said. She shook her head slowly. "No," she replied. "They did. All of them." Outside, Pearl Harbor erupted with distant cheers as news of the victory spread through the base. Inside Station Hypo, the team simply sat in the dim fluorescent light, too exhausted to celebrate. For them, the victory was not thunder or glory. It was a fragile sense of relief, the knowledge that for once the mathematics were on their side. When Margaret finally stepped outside that evening, the tropical air smelled of salt and approaching rain. She looked up at the Pacific sky, imagining the battered carriers limping home, imagining the Japanese fleet burning on the horizon. The war was far from over, but something fundamental had shifted. Japan's unstoppable advance had been shattered. The tide had turned. All because the perfect code made one imperfect repetition, and one woman had been paying attention. The morning after the battle, the Pacific was still burning. Columns of black smoke rose from the wrecks of 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, each one a floating fortress consumed by its own aviation fuel and ammunition. From 1,000 miles away, Margaret and the others in Honolulu received the first post-battle intelligence reports. The language was cold, military, deliberately emotionless. Enemy carrier force destroyed. Own losses. Yorktown damaged, now abandoned. Midway secure. No words could capture the magnitude of what had happened. In the span of 5 hours on June 4th, Japan's invincible strike force, the same fleet that had devastated Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier, had been annihilated. Japan lost 248 aircraft, over 3,000 sailors, and 4 irreplaceable fleet carriers. The United States lost 307 men, 145 aircraft, and 1 carrier, but gained the strategic initiative that would carry it across the Pacific to Tokyo Bay. For the first time since December 7, 1941, Japan was on the defensive. And it had all begun with intelligence, with the ability to see what the enemy believed was invisible. In the cipher room, no one cheered. Margaret read each after-action report as it arrived, typing summaries that would be encrypted and transmitted to Washington. The details were brutal. Deck fires, secondary explosions, pilots trapped in burning cockpits, sailors abandoning ship into oil-slicked waters. She imagined the noise, the smoke, the chaos, and then reminded herself that every death on those burning Japanese ships meant thousands of American lives saved elsewhere. The mathematics of war were cruel, but this was the first time the numbers had favored them. Still, there was no celebration in Honolulu. The work continued because the war did. Even as victory cables poured in from Admiral Nimitz, new intercepts arrived from Japanese naval bases regrouping for counterattacks. Margaret typed through the night, her fingers stained with carbon paper and ink. When she looked up at dawn, the others were asleep at their desks, and the radio still hissed with static. The world had changed, but their room had not.
That afternoon, Commander Rochefort gathered his exhausted team for a brief meeting. His voice was somber, almost apologetic. "What we did here stays here," he said. "You will tell no one. No press, no family, no letters home. If anyone asks how we knew the Japanese were coming to Midway, you say we were lucky." He paused, his voice breaking slightly. "History We'll have to wait for the truth. The victory at Midway was immediately classified at the highest level. The decrypted messages, the additive reconstruction tables, the water shortage ruse, even the existence of Station Hypo itself, all sealed under naval secrecy protocols that would remain in effect for decades. For Margaret, the silence was harder than the work had ever been. She had imagined, foolishly perhaps, that there might be acknowledgement, a commendation, a medal, maybe even a handshake from an admiral. Instead, she was ordered to destroy her personal notes. Rochefort himself locked the torn typewriter ribbon away in a vault labeled "Operational Evidence, Do Not Remove." She watched as it disappeared into darkness, the fragile strip of fabric that had changed the course of history. Weeks later, newsreels and theaters across America declared Midway a triumph of American courage, naval power, and sheer good fortune. No one mentioned codebreakers, and certainly not a woman in a typing pool. Margaret clipped one newspaper photograph, an aerial shot of the burning Japanese carriers, and folded it carefully into her journal. Beneath it, she wrote a single sentence: "Sometimes victory has no name." The strategic effect of Midway was immediate and irreversible. With 4 of its best carriers destroyed and its elite carrier pilots killed, Japan could no longer mount large-scale offensive operations in the Pacific. The United States, meanwhile, seized the initiative, building ships faster than Japan could sink them, island hopping across the Central Pacific toward the Philippines. Every subsequent Allied victory, Guadalcanal, the Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, traced its lineage directly back to the intelligence breakthrough achieved in that basement room in Honolulu. The cryptanalytic techniques pioneered at Station Hypo became the blueprint for Allied code-breaking worldwide, from U-boat Enigma traffic in the Atlantic to German military communications in Europe. But for the people who had done the work, there was only quiet. Commander Rochefort was transferred to other duties soon after Midway, his critical role deliberately obscured by Washington politics and inter-service rivalry. He would not receive full recognition for his contributions until decades after his death. Lieutenant Finnegan returned to Washington. Margaret remained in Honolulu until the end of 1943, still typing intercepts, still forbidden to speak of what she had seen. The war's machinery rolled on, swallowing her back into anonymity. Sometimes, late at night between shifts, she would pause and glance at the empty desk drawer where the ribbon had once been stored. She wondered whether it still existed somewhere in a classified vault, or whether it had been discarded like every other expendable tool of war. To her, it wasn't just a strip of inked fabric. It was proof that perfection is an illusion, that even the mightiest empire can fall because someone, somewhere, hit the wrong key at the wrong time, and because one person was paying attention. In Washington, military analysts began compiling the official classified history of the Battle of Midway. The reports credited improved intelligence coordination and fortunate tactical positioning. The name of the woman who first spotted the pattern in the typewriter ribbon never appeared. Her story, like the ribbon itself, vanished into the archives. For decades, the myth persisted that Midway was won by luck. Hollywood made movies about heroic pilots and brave admirals. No one asked where that luck came from. When the war finally ended in August 1945, the cipher room at Station Hypo fell silent for the first time in 3.5 years. The teleprinters were switched off. The blackout curtains were pulled back. Sunlight, real, unfiltered Hawaiian sunlight, spilled across desks scarred with cigarette burns and stained with ink. For Margaret Howard, the sound of silence was almost unbearable. She sat at her typewriter, fingers poised over the keys, waiting for messages that would never come. Outside, Honolulu erupted in celebration, ships blasting their horns, sailors flooding the streets, strangers dancing in the rain. Inside, she filed her last intelligence summary, signed a non-disclosure oath that forbade her from ever speaking about her work, packed her few belongings, and went home. In Chicago, no one asked about the war in the Pacific. People wanted to forget, to rebuild, to move forward. She found work as a secretary at an insurance firm, a job that required the same precision, the same endless typing, but none of the urgency, none of the stakes. Her coworkers talked about ration cards ending, baseball returning, new cars coming back into production. When she mentioned she had been stationed in Hawaii during the war, they smiled politely, assuming she had been a nurse or perhaps worked in supply logistics. She let them believe it. To tell the truth was impossible, both legally and practically. Even if she tried, it would have sounded absurd. How could she explain that she had helped turn the tide of the largest war in human history because a typewriter ribbon had torn in exactly the right place? Years passed. The machines changed. The world forgot the language of 5-digit cipher groups and additive keys. She married a quiet man who worked in shipping logistics, raised 2 children, and never spoke of her time in the Navy. On her dresser, she kept a single keepsake, an old Underwood typewriter key, the 5 key, polished smooth from years of unconscious touch. Sometimes, when the house was empty and afternoon light slanted through the windows, she would sit at her kitchen table and type rows of meaningless numbers on scratch paper, listening to the sound they made, the same mechanical heartbeat she had once followed through endless nights of war. In 1967, she read in the Chicago Tribune that the Battle of Midway had been won through brilliant American naval strategy and exceptional luck. There was no mention of Station Hypo, no mention of Commander Rochefort, and certainly no mention of her. She clipped the article carefully and placed it in a cardboard box marked 1942. Beneath it, she placed a faded black and white photograph of a young woman in a Navy uniform, unsmiling, her eyes steady on the camera. The handwritten caption on the back read, "Station Hypo, Honolulu, classified." In 1999, more than 50 years after Midway, portions of the Station Hypo files were finally declassified under the Freedom of Information Act. An aging naval historian named Dr. Philip Jacobson, researching the cryptolytic history of the Pacific War, noticed a single line buried in a faded personnel memo dated May 1942. Observation by clerical staff member led to discovery of additive key repetition pattern in JN25 traffic. Recommend commendation. There was no signature, no name, no photograph. Just a faint, bureaucratic trace, like the ghost print of numbers on an old typewriter ribbon. By then, the woman who had noticed the pattern was long gone. Her torn ribbon, evidence item number 47, Station Hypo cryptanalytic materials, remains locked inside a climate-controlled vault at the National Cryptologic Museum in Fort Meade, Maryland. Visitors walk past the display case without noticing, unaware that this unremarkable strip of fabric helped win the most important naval battle in American history. History often remembers the men who gave the orders. It rarely remembers the women who gave those orders meaning. But somewhere in those ghostly ink impressions, barely visible now after 80 years, you can still see the truth, that even the smallest act of attention can rewrite the world, that perfection is a myth and mistakes can be fatal, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with bombs and bullets, but with patience, precision, and a refusal to look away when everyone else has stopped paying attention. If you believe that ordinary people can shape history even when no one remembers their names, write 7 in the comments right now. If you think history only belongs to those in the headlines, hit the like button. And if stories like this move you, stories of courage hidden behind silence, of genius buried in bureaucracy, of victory won by the forgotten, subscribe. Because this channel exists to keep their voices alive, one untold story at a time.